through, tense and uncertain. Lead vehicle, this is truck 14. We're slowing at kilometer marker 123. Something doesn't feel right up here. Rucard's stomach dropped like a stone into cold water. He had driven this route 4 times before, and kilometer marker 123 was exactly the kind of place you didn't want to slow down. A tight S-curve flanked by dense forest on both sides, the road narrowing to barely 1 lane, forcing the convoy into a crawl. The kind of place where ambushes happened, and then he saw it. Off to the right, barely visible through the morning fog, a narrow dirt trail cutting through the trees. It wasn't on the convoy map. It wasn't authorized. Taking it would be a direct violation of orders. But in that moment, staring at the dark curve ahead and remembering the radio reports from 2 days earlier about 3 trucks destroyed and 8 men killed at a similar choke point just 20 miles from here, James Rucard made a decision that would save dozens of lives. He yanked the wheel hard to the right and drove his truck, loaded with 2 tons of high explosives, straight off the authorized route and into the unknown. And what he didn't know yet was that 5 minutes later, the road he'd just abandoned would erupt in gunfire, flames, and screaming. To understand why a 19-year-old truck driver from Maple Heights, Ohio, was making life-or-death decisions in the French countryside before dawn, you have to understand what was happening across Europe in the fall of 1944. The Allied breakout from Normandy had been a stunning success. After nearly 2 months of brutal hedgerow fighting, American, British, and Canadian forces had finally punched through German lines and were now racing eastward across France at a pace that shocked even their own commanders. General George S. Patton's Third Army was advancing so fast that his tanks were outrunning their supply lines by dozens of miles every single day. This created a problem that threatened to stop the entire Allied advance dead in its tracks. Modern mechanized warfare consumed supplies at a staggering rate. A single Sherman tank burned through 60 gallons of fuel every 100 miles. An artillery battery could fire through 1,000 shells in an afternoon. An infantry division needed 300 tons of supplies every single day just to stay combat effective. And with French railroads destroyed by years of Allied bombing and German sabotage, with every bridge blown and every tunnel collapsed, there was only one way to move the mountains of fuel, ammunition, and food that Patton's army needed to keep moving. Trucks, thousands of them. On August 25, 1944, the United States Army created what would become one of the most remarkable logistical operations in military history. They called it the Red Ball Express, named after the railroad term for high-priority freight. It was a dedicated convoy system that would run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, using marked routes and strict protocols to push supplies from the beaches of Normandy all the way to the front lines near the German border. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated more than 6,000 trucks, staffed by over 23,000 drivers. And here's something the history books often gloss over. 75% of those drivers were African American. These were young men, most of them barely out of high school, many of them from southern states where they couldn't vote or eat in the same restaurants as white people, now being handed the keys to 2.5-ton trucks and told to drive hundreds of miles through enemy territory under blackout conditions with no margin for error. They drove GMC CKKW vehicles, the famous deuce and a half that became the workhorse of the American military. Each truck could carry 5 tons when properly loaded, though they often carried more. The drivers slept in their cabs when they slept at all. They ate cold K-rations. They drove in convoys that stretched for miles, sometimes so long you couldn't see the end of the line. The rules were brutal in their simplicity. You had an assigned route, and you followed it exactly. No deviations, no shortcuts, no creative thinking. You drove with lights dimmed or completely blacked out to avoid German aircraft. You didn't stop except at designated checkpoints. If your truck broke down, you had 5 minutes to fix it, or it got pushed off the road and left behind. The convoy never stopped. The mission was everything. Between August and November of 1944, these drivers would transport over 400,000 tons of supplies across France, an average of 12,000 tons every single day. James David Rucard had joined the Red Ball Express in late August, just weeks after it started. He was 19 years old, thin and quiet, with the kind of calm that comes naturally to some people and gets mistaken for timidity by those who don't know better. He had grown up in Maple Heights, a working-class suburb of Cleveland, where his father had worked in a steel mill and his mother had taken in laundry to help make ends meet. Rucard had been driving since he was 14, first delivering groceries in a beat-up Ford pickup, then working for a trucking company during his last year of high school. When he was drafted in early 1944, the Army took one look at his driving record and sent him straight to the Transportation Corps. By September, he had driven thousands of miles across France, often through territory that had been in German hands just days earlier. He had learned to read the signs that other drivers missed: the way smoke rose from a tree line, the absence of birds, the too-perfect stillness that preceded an ambush. He didn't carry a rifle, just a standard-issue M1911 pistol that wouldn't do much good if they ran into real trouble. But what he carried in the back of his truck was often more powerful than any infantry weapon: 105mm artillery shells that could reach out 12 miles and destroy a bunker, a tank, or a company of men. On the evening of September 8th, Rucard received orders for what the dispatch called a priority run. He was to transport 40 crates of 105mm ammunition from a supply depot near Saint-Lô to a forward staging area just outside Metz, a distance of roughly 250 miles. The delivery had to be completed before dawn on September 10th, or a planned artillery strike supporting the 14th Armored Division would have to be delayed, possibly costing lives and momentum. It was the kind of mission the Red Ball Express ran 100 times a day. Routine, essential, deadly if anything went wrong. The convoy assembled just after midnight. 47 trucks in total, each one loaded with ammunition or fuel drums. Rucard was assigned the lead position, which meant he would set the pace and navigate the route. The night was clear when they started, stars visible through breaks in the clouds, the air cool and damp with the smell of diesel and mud. They rolled out in a long mechanical snake, engines rumbling low, drivers hunched forward in their seats, eyes straining against the darkness. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. They passed through small French villages where the windows were dark and the streets empty, where the only signs of life were the occasional dog barking or a farmer's light flickering in a barn. The roads were rough, cratered by bombing and pitted by months of heavy military traffic, but the trucks handled it. These vehicles were built for punishment. They had solid axles and leaf spring suspensions that could absorb hits that would cripple a civilian truck. The drivers knew their machines intimately, could hear a problem developing in the engine or the transmission long before it became critical. But as they approached the second hour of the drive, something began to change. The fog rolled in thick and fast, pouring down from the hills like liquid smoke. Visibility dropped from 50 feet to 20, then to 10. Rucard leaned forward until his nose almost touched the windshield, trying to make out the road ahead. Behind him the other trucks closed up, each driver keeping his eyes locked on the dim red taillights of the vehicle in front. This was dangerous. In fog this thick, if one truck stopped suddenly, the whole convoy could accordion into a massive pileup. Then Rucard saw the first sign. A thin column of smoke rising from the tree line to the east, barely visible through the fog. It wasn't thick black smoke like you'd see from a burning building or a knocked-out vehicle. It was thin and wispy, the kind of smoke that comes from a campfire that's been recently extinguished. Someone had been there, recently, and they had left in a hurry. The second sign came a few minutes later. A dead horse lying near the edge of the road, its body still intact, no visible wounds. Dead animals weren't unusual in France that autumn. The whole country was littered with them, casualties of bombing and artillery and the simple chaos of war. But something about this one felt wrong. The body looked too fresh, too deliberately placed, and the flies that should have been swarming it in thick clouds were absent. It had been dead for less than an hour. Rucard's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His mind was racing now, processing details, looking for patterns. He had been through this area before. He knew the terrain. And he knew that in less than a mile, they would reach kilometer marker 123, the tight S-curve that forced convoys to slow to a crawl. Then the radio crackled to life. Lead vehicle. This is truck 14. Road surface is slippery near kilometer 123. Tires are losing traction. We're going to have to slow down. Rucard's pulse quickened. Slippery roads in September when it hadn't rained in 3 days. That meant something else. Oil, maybe, or mud that had been deliberately churned up, or something worse. He stared ahead into the fog, and that's when he saw them. Tiny flashes of reflected light in the tree line, just for a split second. Like moonlight bouncing off metal. A helmet, binoculars, a rifle scope. Something was out there in the woods, watching and waiting. Rucard reached for the radio transmitter and keyed the mic. This is lead vehicle requesting verification of safe passage beyond marker 123, seeing possible signs of enemy scouting in the area. The response came back almost immediately, calm and procedural. Negative, lead vehicle. No confirmed enemy activity in your sector. Proceed as planned on designated route. But Rucard wasn't convinced. Every instinct he had developed over months of driving these roads was screaming at him that something was wrong. He keyed the mic again. This is Rucard. I'm seeing too many signs. I'm suggesting alternate route, civilian path Charlie 7. It connects back to the main road 2 clicks past the marker. Unofficial but drivable. We can avoid the S-curve completely. There was a long pause. Then the voice came back, harder this time, with an edge of irritation. That route is unauthorized. Stay on designated route. Do not deviate. Rucard stared ahead. There it was, barely visible through the fog. The beginning of the S-curve at kilometer marker 123. The road narrowed. The forest pressed in from both sides, tall and dark and silent. It looked like the throat of a trap. And just to the right, almost invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, he could see it. A break in the brush. A narrow dirt trail cutting through the trees. The old civilian road, unmapped and unmaintained, that he had noticed weeks earlier while scouting a fuel drop. It was barely wide enough for one truck. It was rutted and rough. And it was absolutely, unquestionably, against regulations to use it. But James Rucard had been driving long enough to know when a road felt wrong. He had been in enough close calls to trust his gut, and his gut was telling him that if he led this convoy into that S-curve, some of them weren't coming out. He reached for the gear shift. Then he pressed the radio button one more time, and this time he spoke to the entire convoy, not to headquarters. This is Rucard. I'm changing course. Taking Charlie 7. Follow me. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't hesitate. He just yanked the wheel hard to the right, and his truck, loaded with 2 tons of high-explosive ammunition, veered off the main road and disappeared into the trees. Behind him, there was a moment of silence. Then, one by one, the trucks began to follow. 46 vehicles, each one carrying enough firepower to destroy a city block, each one driven by a man who had just watched his lead driver commit what could very easily be a court-martial offense. They followed because in war, especially at night, especially in enemy territory, you follow the truck in front of you. You trust the man at the front of the line. The trail was even worse than Rucard had remembered. The forest closed in like a fist. Branches scraped against the canvas covers and slapped against the mirrors. The road was barely wide enough for the trucks to pass without sliding into the ditches on either side. Roots and rocks jutted up from the packed earth, making the suspension groan and the cargo shift in the back. Every bump felt like it could tip the whole load. Every turn felt like gambling with physics. Rukard drove with his jaw clenched and his eyes locked forward. Sweat ran down his back despite the cold. Behind him, the convoy stretched out in a long, slow-moving line, each truck crawling forward at barely 10 miles per hour. The radios were silent. Nobody was asking questions. Nobody was complaining. They were too focused on not crashing, not getting stuck, not setting off the tons of high explosives they were sitting on top of. And then, faint and distant, they heard it. A dull thud, like a hammer striking wood, followed by another. Then came the unmistakable sound of explosions. Sharp, heavy, final. The radio exploded with panicked voices. "This is Truck 14 Alpha. We're taking fire. S-curve at kilometer 123. Ambush. I repeat, ambush." Another voice, higher, breaking with fear. "Truck 17 is hit. We're burning. Repeat, cargo is burning." Rukard's blood ran cold. Those were the trucks that had stayed on the main route, the ones that hadn't followed him into the woods. They had driven straight into the ambush. He grabbed the radio. "This is lead vehicle. We are off route, diverted via Charlie 7. Confirming ambush at kilometer 123. Request status on Convoy Alpha route." The response came back slower this time, the voice stunned. "Confirmed, Rukard. Ambush in progress. Multiple vehicles destroyed. Fire still active. You're clear of it. Your diversion might have just saved the whole damn line." Rukard didn't reply. He couldn't. His throat had closed up. His hands were shaking on the wheel. Behind him, every driver in the convoy had heard the transmission. They understood. If they had stayed on the main road, if Rukard had followed orders, they would be dead right now. Burned alive or cut down by machine gun fire in a narrow S-curve, with no room to maneuver and no chance to fight back. The Germans had been waiting, and they had nearly walked straight into it, but they weren't safe yet. A few hundred yards down the trail, one of the rear trucks hit a patch of soft mud and sank up to its axles. The tires spun uselessly, flinging mud in wide arcs. "Vehicle 32 is stuck," someone radioed. "We're blocked." Rukard jumped out of his cab. The ground was slick and cold, sucking at his boots. He shouted for chains and waved the second truck forward. They had to move fast. The sun was starting to rise, and if German scouts heard the explosions from the ambush and came looking for stragglers, they'd be sitting ducks. Two men ran forward with tow hooks. One of them slipped and nearly went under the wheels. Another cursed as he jammed his knuckle trying to connect the steel links. Rukard bent down and hooked the chains himself, his fingers already bleeding from the cold and the rough metal. "Pull!" he shouted. The second truck revved its engine. The tires shrieked. The stuck vehicle rocked once, twice, then jerked forward like a beast breaking free of chains. The convoy began moving again. As they crested the ridge, the tree line opened up and the main road reappeared ahead. Behind them, to the south, smoke still hung in the morning air. A faint orange glow flickered through the fog. That was where the ambush had happened, where trucks were burning, where men were dying or already dead. Rukard climbed back into his cab and put the truck in gear. His hands were still shaking. He didn't look back. The convoy rolled into the Met's staging area just after 2 in the afternoon. The sun was high and pale. Dust coated everything. The men climbed out of their trucks slowly, stiffly like old men. They should have felt relief. They had made it. Every truck, every man, every crate of ammunition. The mission, by every measure, was a success. But Rukard didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. He could see the officers moving across the yard, notebooks in hand, scanning license plates. Within minutes, a young lieutenant approached. "Sergeant James David Rukard?" "Yes, sir." "You're the one who diverted Convoy Bravo off the authorized route this morning?" "Yes, sir." "On whose authority?" "My own, sir." The lieutenant stared at him for a long moment. Then he glanced down at his clipboard. Did you receive any orders permitting that deviation? No, sir. Were you aware that Convoy Bravo was to follow the Alpha 3 corridor without exception? Yes, sir. And yet you turned the convoy onto an unverified civilian trail, not listed on any military map. I did, sir. The lieutenant flipped a page. Do you know what happened to the rest of the column that remained on Alpha 3? Rucard nodded. We picked up the transmissions. At least 3 trucks destroyed. Multiple casualties. 12 men killed, 8 wounded, 3 vehicles lost, cargo destroyed. Rucard closed his eyes for a moment. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. The lieutenant didn't reply. He simply turned and gestured toward a tent. You're to report for debriefing immediately. Inside the tent, the air was stifling. A single fan buzzed weakly in the corner. At a folding table sat an older officer, gray-haired with sharp eyes and a weathered face. Sit down, son. Rucard sat. What you did this morning, do you understand the seriousness of it? Yes, sir. Tell me why you did it. Rucard didn't hesitate. I saw the signs, sir. Smoke. Dead animals. Reflections in the tree line. I knew the curve at kilometer marker 123. It was a kill zone. I made the call. The officer leaned forward. You didn't call for backup. You didn't wait for intelligence confirmation. You took 47 trucks full of high explosives and turned them into the woods on your own judgment. Yes, sir. You understand that if just one of those trucks had been disabled, it could have stranded the entire convoy, caused a pileup, exposed your men? Yes, sir. You'd be court-martialed for that. Yes, sir, I would. The officer leaned back. But you didn't lose a single vehicle. No, sir. You didn't lose a single man. No, sir. And the supplies you delivered today are going to the 14th Armored Division. They're moving out in 24 hours. Your delivery kept that operation on schedule. Rucard said nothing. The officer picked up a file folder and tapped it once. You're not getting a medal, Sergeant. Not today. Probably not ever. You won't even get a commendation in your file. Not officially. He looked Rucard in the eye. But I want you to understand something. You made the right call. Rucard blinked. I can't say that in writing. Not in this war. Too many rules. Too many layers. But between you and me, we need more drivers who think like you do. Yes, sir, Rucard replied quietly. The officer stood and extended his hand. Now go get some food. You've earned it. The war ended 8 months later. The parades came. The headlines. The celebrations in every American city. Soldiers adorned with medals marched through streets lined with cheering crowds. But there was no parade for the Red Ball Express. No medals for the drivers who had worked 18-hour days with no weapons and no recognition. No newsreels about the convoys that kept Patton's tanks moving forward. No stories about the 19-year-old men who delivered shells under constant threat of ambush. James David Rucard returned to Ohio quietly. He found work as a bus driver in Cleveland, a far cry from the chaos and danger he had faced just months earlier. He got married, raised a family, and settled into a life that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. Yet, beneath the veneer of normalcy, the weight of his experiences lingered. For decades, he didn't talk much about what had happened on that foggy morning in September 1944. Why would he? He had followed his gut, broken the rules, and saved dozens of lives. Yet he came home to a country that didn't always remember who had kept the guns loaded and the engines running. The history books celebrated the generals, Patton, Eisenhower, Bradley, but they overlooked the countless individuals who played crucial roles in the war effort. They didn't mention Rucard, or the thousands of drivers like him, whose contributions were essential for the Allied forces to achieve victory. Without fuel, tanks don't move. Without ammunition, rifles are useless. Without drivers, the greatest army in the world grinds to a halt. For 82 days in the fall of 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies, nearly all handled by young, undertrained, underpaid drivers, most of them African American, most of them invisible to the headlines. They were the unsung heroes whose efforts made the difference on the battlefield. Decades later, in a small interview room at the Veterans History Project, Rucard finally spoke about the war. He was in his 80s by then, sitting upright in a clean button-down shirt, the fabric pressed neatly. His voice still carried that soft Ohio accent, a reminder of his roots. "We didn't think about being heroes," he said, his tone reflective. "We just wanted to get the job done. You couldn't stop and think. You just kept going, one trip after another, and you prayed this wouldn't be your last." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We were just truck drivers, but we moved history." That line resonated deeply with the interviewer. We moved history. Rucard didn't mean it as poetry. He meant it literally. They moved fuel, ammunition, food, and hope across roads that were never meant to handle the demands of war. What Rucard did that morning, turning left when everyone else was supposed to turn right, was a decision born from instinct and experience. It was never written in an official report. There was no commendation, no congressional record, no monument honoring his bravery. Yet the men who followed him remembered. Years later, at a reunion, one of the drivers from the rear of the convoy recounted, "I had my hand on the wheel. I was going to keep straight. Then I saw Rucard veer off. No radio command, no briefing, just instinct. And I said to myself, if he's going, I'm going." That's how they lived. That's how they survived. In the fog of war, amidst chaos and uncertainty, they relied on each other, on trust and shared experiences. Today, the Red Ball Express is barely a footnote in most textbooks, a logistical detail, a side note. What it represents, however, is bigger than any headline. It symbolizes the unglamorous, uncelebrated backbone of victory, the people who weren't on the front lines, but without whom the front lines would have collapsed. People like James Rucard. He passed away in 2016 at the age of 91. Despite his pivotal role in the war, most Americans never knew his name. His legacy lives on in every military supply line, every convoy commander, every driver who has to make a decision in the dark with lives hanging in the balance, and in every young person who has ever had to trust their instincts when the rules said no. Because sometimes courage isn't loud. It doesn't wear medals or give speeches. Sometimes courage is just a 19-year-old kid from Ohio sitting behind the wheel of a truck in the fog, seeing something that doesn't feel right and having the guts to turn the wheel, to break the rules, to trust himself when no one else did, to keep driving forward even when the whole world is telling him to stop. That morning in September was a microcosm of the war itself, filled with uncertainty, danger, and the need for quick thinking. Rucard's decision to divert the convoy wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a moment of clarity amidst the fog of war. The signs were there, clear to him yet invisible to others. A thin column of smoke, a dead animal, the eerie silence of the forest, all indicators that something was wrong. The broader context of the Red Ball Express reveals just how vital these drivers were to the war effort. As the Allies advanced through France, supply lines were stretched thin. The destruction of railroads and bridges made truck convoys the only viable means to transport essential supplies. The Red Ball Express was established to meet this urgent need, a logistical marvel that operated around the clock, ensuring that troops had what they needed to fight. Drivers like Rucard faced immense challenges. They navigated treacherous roads, often under blackout conditions, with the constant threat of enemy attack. Their work was dangerous, yet they did it with dedication and resolve. They were young men thrust into a chaotic world, and many of them were from marginalized communities, yet they rose to the occasion. In the years that followed the war, Rucard's life unfolded like many others. He found stability in a civilian job, raising a family and contributing to his community. Yet, the memories of war lingered. He witnessed the impact of his actions, even if indirectly. The lessons learned on those foggy roads shaped his character, a testament to the resilience and courage that often goes unrecognized. As he reflected on his experiences during interviews, Rucard began to understand the importance of sharing his story. He became a bridge between the past and future, connecting younger generations to the sacrifices of those who came before them. He emphasized that every role in the war, no matter how small it seemed, contributed to the larger narrative of history. The Red Ball Express, though often overlooked, serves as a powerful reminder of the collective effort required to achieve victory. It embodies the spirit of teamwork, determination, and the willingness to step outside one's comfort zone for the greater good. Rucard's story is not just about a single decision. It's about the countless choices made by individuals who trusted their instincts and chose to act when it mattered most. In the end, Rucard's legacy extends beyond the battlefield. It lives on in every military supply line, every truck driver who faces challenges on the road, and in every young person who dares to follow their instincts, even when the rules seem rigid. His story is a testament to the quiet bravery that shapes our world, often unseen and uncelebrated. As we remember figures like James David Rucard, we must recognize that history is not solely written by the victors, but by the countless individuals who played their part in the narrative. The Red Ball Express may remain a footnote in history, but the courage displayed by its drivers and the lives they saved will forever echo through time, reminding us all of the importance of bravery, intuition, and the power of following one's instincts in the face of adversity. In every challenge we face, whether on the battlefield or in our daily lives, we can draw inspiration from Rucard and his fellow drivers. They exemplified the idea that sometimes the most heroic acts come not from grand gestures, but from the simple decision to do what is right, even when it is difficult. And in doing so, they moved history.